We're glad to welcome Dr. Helen Lewis, former college professor, a longtime educator, and a campaigner for Jim B. Carmichael in 1946. So it's 1946, Jimmy Carmichael is running against Eugene Talmadge for governor, and you were there.
I had just graduated from college, Georgia State College for Women, where we had gotten really interested in politics. Ellis Arnold had allowed 18-year-olds to vote, and I was one of the first to be able to vote. As a matter of fact, I was able to cast my first vote for Franklin Roosevelt the last time he ran. And so we became very interested in trying to maintain the progressive government that Ellis Arnold had produced. And since he could not succeed himself and had selected Carmichael, we became big Carmichael supporters in the college. And we formed a League of Women Voters, one of the first of young women students. But we also formed something called the Student League for Good Government. And that was sort of, I think, throughout the state. I know the University of Georgia had a Student League for Good Government. And so when the campaign started, they asked me and George Doss from the University of Georgia to come and be in the campaign headquarters and organize students for Carmichael. And so we did. We lived in the campaign headquarters at the Piedmont Hotel all summer and had an office called the Student League for Good Government. And we organized students all over the state of Georgia. We had students in every county. We had them in giving out sound trucks. We had some Alan Colley, who was from Grantville, whose mother ran the women's campaign for Carmichael. He was running around in a sound truck. He also flew an airplane and dropped leaflets in some places. We had students writing radio spots and doing those, letters to the editor, making speeches at Kiwanis clubs and anywhere that they were allowed to. But we had students organized, I think, in every county of Georgia. Well, in the headquarters, they thought we were kind of a joke, and we were called the Children's Crusade. And so there was a lot of joking with us and a lot of students hanging out there all the time. It was a very lively place and a very exciting summer. We were so sure we were going to win. And actually we did bring in, I think, we always said 100,000 extra votes into that campaign, more so than any campaign prior to that had ever had voted in Georgia. And so we took full credit for all of that, which probably wasn't exactly true. But anyway, that's how I was there. And we were very excited. We were so sure we were beating both Rivers, and because Ed Rivers was running, as well as Eugene Talmadge. And the night of the election, we were just, exuberant. We were so sure we were winning. We went over and visited the Rivers headquarters and talked about didn't he look natural and treated it like it was a big funeral. And so we were just, and then when the county unit votes came in and we had lost the election, it was a very, very sad place, as you can imagine. So it was a really important time for me because I had just graduated from college and I was going to graduate school that fall. So I left the state and went to Duke University that fall. So I missed all the excitement when Talmadge died and Herman claimed the office, and we had 3 governors, and so I just wanted to be back because it convinced me that I wanted to go into politics.
Well, did you have a political career after that?
Well, not really. My idea at that particular time was I was going to I'd already been accepted at Duke, and I was going to go to Duke for a year, and then I was going to come back and buy a a newspaper. And some of the people in the Democratic Party were all in favor of that and were going to help me do that. And then I would get into politics. So I was all determined to get into politics. Instead, I go to Duke. It's right after World War II, veterans coming in. I'd been at a women's college for 4 years. And so what did I do is get married to a Virginian, ended up at the University of Virginia. And, but I did come back after the year at Duke and work for Melvin Thompson. They called me after the court had decided that Thompson was the legal governor. And I had made friends with DeWitt Roberts. And DeWitt Roberts was the sort of public relations ghostwriter. He was called the real ghost for Ellis Arnold's books. As a matter of fact, I helped him do some research for The Shore Dimly Seen. And so he just insisted I come back and work with the Thompson as governor and be one of the ghostwriters. So I worked there for the year from 47. And we had a house across the street from the Capitol, which Herman Talmadge called the haunted house. And I think in one of his big editorials, I was named as the littlest ghost or the smallest ghost or something in there. And one of the things that I did was, well, answer a lot of letters. You know, the governor gets a whole lot of requests for information about certain things, about departments or what's going on in this. So I answered letters. He was doing a sort of a weekly sort of fireside chat kind of thing. I wrote some of those speeches. And other speeches I remember DeWitt Roberts had me write one he was giving to a fraternity here at the University of Georgia, and it was supposed to be glorifying the Old South. Well, I was pretty much an activist and a radical in those days, and this was sort of a joke that I was going to have to write something supporting the glory of the old Confederacy or something, which was not the sort of thing I wanted to write. So I did that. Also, one of the things I did was one of the legislators had a son in college who needed a term paper on the prison system. So I wrote a research paper for him on the history of the prison system in Georgia. So those were the kind of jobs that I had in the haunted house. And I stayed there until June of 48, I guess. And that summer, I'd married. I had married in that fall of 47. So that while I was working there, I was married. And we were living in a trailer out at Emory University on the campus for veterans who had come back from the war and because what happened was my husband, who was a graduate student at Duke with me, when I came back to Georgia, he came and enrolled at Emory, and we married, and I lived in this trailer in the middle of the campus between the post office and the cafeteria. So it was one of those little trailers that didn't even have a bathroom in it. You had to sort of go up the walkway to a big trailer which had all the bathrooms, and here were all these wives and children and people running up as the students were going between the post office and the cafeteria. And I wondered how many young men decided never to get married based on seeing how we were living in this little slum in the middle of Emory University. So okay, that's another story, but anyway, that's where I was living. So that summer I got asked to work with the YWCA office in Atlanta, And I had been very active in the YWCA at Georgia State College for Women, and we had been actively involved in what I call the early civil rights movement, because we would go into integrated meetings and things like that. So I was very interested in the YWCA, so I worked in that office that summer. And that's another story that I'll tell you later, if you would like, about how a group of us got arrested and made the front page of the Atlanta Constitution for mixed dance, but that's another story.
Let's get back to the
Carmichael.
election in 1946.
Okay.
Actually, Mr. Carmichael received more votes statewide than Governor Talmadge, but he was defeated by the county unit system. What was his reaction to that?
Well, we were all just devastated. I mean, and at that time, I think that stirred up the whole movement against the county unit system. And then James Mackey, who was at Emory, who began to lead a real campaign against that. And all of us were really, I mean, it was a sad place that evening in our headquarters. And a lot of people came by, and everybody was, you know, just sort of devastated because we had done, we thought, such a good job, and we had brought in the votes, and it was, so I don't remember any personal reactions that he had. I mean, I just remember the whole sense of distress on part of everybody who was there. He was in and out of the campaign office, and as a matter of fact, I had a room in the Piedmont Hotel, which was also used during the day for anybody who was there, including Jimmy Carmichael, who would need to change clothes or dress or take a shower or shave. And so I was oftentimes going back to my room and finding Jimmy Carmichael's clothes. And this got to be quite a joke with other students who would come and visit, and they'd say, uh-oh, what's going on here? What is your role in this campaign? But he was not, I mean, we were so busy, you know, organizing the students and keeping all of that going that there was not a lot of interaction with him. So in that sense, I'm not that clear on, I don't think he hung around the office a lot that night. I think he probably went home to his family. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure. Mm-hmm. So that's not.
Do you recall what part, if any, Governor Arnold played in that race?
No, he must have done some campaigning, but I don't know. And I never saw him much either.
That race was typical of Georgia's two-party system at the time. You had the Ed Rivers group, mm-hmm. Which included Governor Arnold and Mr. Thompson. And then you had the Talmadges, who had prevailed for at least 20 years mm-hmm. prior to that election. Did Carmichael have any real interest in politics after that election?
Not that I know of, because I was away then the next year at Duke, and then I was back for a year in the office, you know, working for Thompson. And I don't remember him ever showing up or hanging out or anything. I think he just disappeared, mm-hmm. went back home. And so it was we of course was in the haunted house, which was this house across the way, and it was more like a press room. Mm-hmm. There were reporters in and out of there. They came to us for information. The Atlanta Constitution, Ken Turner, was it his name? Ken
Turner, yes.
Yeah, he would show up and check with what was going on with DeRette Roberts and all of us. Mm-hmm. It was, so there was things going on. I think this was the time when they bought Jekyll Island. There was a lot of that going on at the time. So I don't think Carmichael, had any relationship. Now, if he did over in the Capitol, that was kind of across the road, and we would maybe go over to the office to pick up mail and get our assignments and that sort of thing, but that was our main responsibility. And after that, I don't know that I don't think the Student League for Good Government even continued on college campuses. I think it was such a state of depression and such a state of repression, because up until that time there had been a sort of a safe period, I felt call it, in Georgia under Ellis Arnold. And we would still go into integrated conferences at Atlanta University, Payne College in Augusta. The YWCA was very active in opposing segregation, but there had been crosses burned on the campus at GSCW. The woman who headed up this organization for the preservation of white women said that GSCW and Agnes Scott were communist schools because students were going to integrated meetings. So there was a lot of sort of activism going on in the 30s and the 40s. By the middle of the 40s, there was this, as I say, safe period. But Guy Wells, who was the president of GSCW, came to the YWCA and said, I want you to keep doing these integrated meetings, but don't tell me. So what happened was all the activism went underground. And I think, and that continued into that summer of 48 when I was there. These things were secret, and they were not recorded. I mean, you can go to the college newspaper now and look at all the 40s. There's never a mention of any of those conferences or any of those things that were going on. In the 30s, it was very open and in the newspapers. By that time, it had gone underground, and by the 50s, the Y had just sort of gone out of business almost. It became just Bible study and devotions and all of the really activism. I mean, when I was there, we had Clarence Jordan coming and speaking. We had Frank McAllister coming and speaking.
Tell us who Clarence Jordan is.
Clarence Jordan was a Baptist preacher who had bought this land down in South Georgia and started an integrated farm. And he was harassed and by the Ku Klux Klan. People in America wouldn't even sell him seeds. He would run out of the Baptist church. It was a dangerous place there. But he continued and developed this koinonia, from which Habitat for Humanity developed and grew. And it still exists as a communal farm and they sell pecans and fruitcakes and things like that, and still have an ongoing operation. He died, and after that it was not as active as it was before, but it is still a business and still a cooperative farm. And Jimmy Carter even went there and, as a student, I think, and did a little work. And I mean, it now has a good reputation, but in the early days, it was like something that to be destroyed. It was something of a scourge on the good old South, And so, anyway, those people came and talked. Lucy Randolph Mason was a real impressive, wonderful woman, a labor organizer. So those were the things that were happening. By the 50s, all of that was gone. And the college no longer gave financial support to the Y, and they encouraged the denominations, the religious denominations, to take over. And so the whole activism, by 1960, a student got suspended and had to leave the college because she attended black conference in Payne and also went to black churches. So all the sort of student activism left the campuses and became part of SNCC and SOC and all of those other organizations. So if you wanted to be an activist then, you couldn't do it through the college as you did in the 30s and 40s and 20s even. There were interracial meetings in the 20s and a lot of sort of activism on the part of Southern women's colleges. When I tell that story to people that I was doing all this stuff in the 40s, that there was early civil rights movement, they say, oh no, that didn't start then. It started after 54, it started in the 60s, but that was happening at that particular time. And so, but after Arnold and when Talmadge came back, the segregationists really put such pressure on the colleges that they were afraid to do anything. And they soon got rid of Guy Wells. And he ended up working with the Southern Regional Council and supporting and working for the integration of the schools. And so it was a pretty interesting period of time.
And looking back in history, what do you think was the turning point in people of Georgia accepting racial integration as a way of life?
I guess when Eisenhower sent the troops to Little Rock, when there was a real, and Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. I mean, it became clear that there was going to be a lot of pressure. I was in Virginia at that time, teaching in a branch college at the University of Virginia, in Prince Edward County, and the Virginia schools, you know, refused to integrate, and there were schools all over, and of course that was the beginning of all these little private Christian schools so that people could go, not go to the integrated schools. But there's still a lot of racism, and there's still a lot of people homeschooling and sending kids to private schools still in the South. But there's a whole lot more acceptance, and I think that's why young people do not, some of the younger people who've grown up in integrated schools don't have some of those phobias and problems that some of the older people in their parents or their grandparents had. As incredible changes, really, in terms of the amount of fear that we would have. I remember spending a week, back in the 40s, 44 I guess, spent a weekend in the dormitory at Spelman, living with black students and eating in the cafeteria with black students. And that was, you know, like the first time I'd ever been in a social relationship with black people, you know. And you couldn't go out and eat together in public. And that was the same time when we all got arrested. I mean, a little later, it was 48 when we got arrested in Atlanta, and I was working with the YWCA. But anyway, I remember eating in the cafeteria and sitting by with black women, and one of them got up and left, who was sitting next to me. And the other woman on the other side said, "Oh, I'm real sorry, but you know, she's prejudiced against white people." And it just shocked me, because I thought, I'm supposed to be the one that's prejudiced. I didn't know prejudice acted both ways. So it was, all of these were real eye-opening experiences, which was sponsored through the YWCA, which was one of the very earliest of these sort of early civil rights activities. And let me tell you about that summer of 48, if you don't mind. Do you want to hear that?
Sure.
Okay. I had been working in the haunted house, and I was getting ready to leave and go to Virginia, so I took the job that summer. They needed somebody in the YWCA regional office, which was located, I think, on Lucky Street. It was a building which had next to it the CIO offices, and they had a sort of a training center there where they were training union organizers, and we were next door. And so a group of seminarians came to Atlanta to do sort of work with poor people and help build houses or ramps or so forth. And there were 2 blacks in the group, and the rest they were from Vanderbilt, Yale, different colleges and seminaries, and they were sponsored by the Interracial Commission of Atlanta, I think, and they were living on the black campus at Atlanta University, but they asked the YWCA if they would have a little reception for them. So we asked the CIO if we could use their little training room next door, and so we had a reception for them. And I was there in the office, so I invited all the YWCA women from GSCW who were in Atlanta that summer. Some had just graduated and had jobs. One was working with the Red Cross, I think, or the Girl Scouts. It was the Girl Scouts. Others had jobs, and others were just home for the summer. So we had a group come in, and we were having a little reception, and we were doing some little dance like a little get-together thing like the Virginia Reel. And the police come in and just say, "Oh, keep on, keep on doing what you're doing." And we looked at them, and then they had us all sit down, and they called us out individually and said, "What would your daddy think if he saw you dancing with a black man?" Or they used the N-word, of course. And so, I mean, so individually they did that. Each one of us gave us a ticket for disorderly conduct, disturbing the peace, and then told us to go home and come to court later. So they didn't take us to jail. And there was some preachers there and their wives. There was another black couple. So I think there were at least 3 black people and 18 white people, something like that. It was the numbers. And so we went home. The next morning, on the front page of the Constitution was mixed dance, and listed everybody's names and addresses. So, I mean, I had to call my father up in Cumming, Georgia, and I said, "Look at the paper and go explain to your neighbors what's going on." And so, luckily, he said, "Well, I'm proud of you." But because he had been a pretty liberal anti-Talmadge person for years, and but other students and other people, some of the girls lost their jobs, some of them got run out of their apartments. Parents were really upset, and wrote all sorts of letters back and forth and telegrams to their daughters about, what do you mean being in a mixed dance and that sort of stuff. Well, it appeared then again in the Sunday papers. It appeared in the Journal and the Constitution, which were 2 separate ones. And then, of course, Herman got hold of it. So when we were supposed to go to court, the Klan was out. And so we got James Mackey from Emory as our lawyer, and I have a piece. He wrote up a piece describing what happened, and for everybody's family and for everybody to know. And there was a lot of complaints to Ralph McGill and everybody for doing that, and it was kind of a mistake. The police had been watching that place because they had integrated training sessions with the CIO, so they wanted to catch a CIO training session, and instead they caught this bunch of YWCA girls and preachers, and so it was a little embarrassing, but it was a very, a a shocking experience for all of us. Finally, Mackey got the charge dropped to disorderly conduct. Got that, and it's just disturbing the peace. And we all paid $25, except for 2 or 3 people who lived in Atlanta and decided to go ahead and fight it through. But the rest of us had going back to school or had things to do. I was moving to Virginia, and so we paid our $25, and that was the end of it. But
who was mayor back then? Do you remember? Was it Mr. Hartsfield?
Might have been. I'm not. This would be 48. I'm not sure, but we should have. And I imagine the people who lived here and continued to probably made their complaints to the mayor, but rest of us just went our way and got out of it. But that was, and so the whole. I mean, there was this sort of open period, I think, when Ellis Arnold was there. There was, well, because he did not fight against the primaries being integrated. He did not fight against the transportation that was integrated during that period. There were a lot of little changes that happened, and he was urged to, try to fight against it, and he didn't. It was open. And then he allowed 18-year-olds to vote, and that's how we got involved in politics. And we were the first state to do that. And so I feel real proud that I was one of the first 18-year-olds that got to vote. Well, by the time I was in the campaign, I was 21, I guess, at that point. But I was still pretty young and sort of idealistic, and it was right after the war, and we were gonna have peace and never have war again. And I know one student and I were going around making speeches at Kiwanis about the United Nations and how important that was. So it was like, we thought, the New South was with us until segregationists came back and put such pressure on the schools, so that the schools have never, the activism, students became active, but they were active without the cooperation of the administration, because Guy Wells was a pretty remarkable president of that college. So anyway, that's where we are.
Let me ask you a question about Carmichael. I have here a statement that he made speaking to students at Emory University in 1950. In which he told the audience, "I sicken of these people who are always waving the Confederate flag and telling us what a glorious heritage the South has. No one denies this heritage, but too many of our people want to keep on living on who they are and where they came from." And he encouraged Georgians to embrace change. And my question about Carmichael is, if he had been elected, do you think he would have taken steps toward racial harmony in Georgia?
I think he would have tried. I mean, I think, he was still up against a sort of a strong, powerful group of people in Herman and that crowd. I mean, Herman's little newspaper, the Statesman, New Statesman, was just on everybody's case. And so there was, but I do think, like Ellis Arnold, he would have continued that a safer period for other groups to be active and do stuff. He might not have been able to do as much with his legislature as he would have wanted to do, but I think he would have made a period where, and I believe, they did, of course, get rid of the county unit system. And that was, so there were progressive things happening in Georgia, but it was harder. It was much, much harder. And you had, Lester Maddox and the whole crowd, in power. There's a limit to what, colleges can do, because they're going to lose their money. And colleges were, I know during the 30s, a group of YWCA girls at GSCW went to Fort Valley and had a day talking to black students and faculty. The word got out that they had caroused and had an orgy with black male students. And this was this woman who headed up, I've forgotten her name. Do you remember the name of the woman who headed up that Society for the Protection of White Women? She called Talmadge and sent letters to all of the legislature about this affair. And Guy Wells had to fire the YWCA secretary named Polly Moss. They claimed that she had Negro blood because otherwise there would be no way in which she would have allowed those students to go down to Fort Valley. Well, it was at that point that Talmadge, you know, when he got the whole school system discredited, you know, he required Guy Wells to get rid of the accountant firm because they were progressive Democrats and had been working with the Y in taking students to interracial meetings, and made them fire another teacher and hire this woman who was a real segregationist. And the only way he was going to get any money was at that time. So having a segregationist or strong segregationist in power meant that the colleges and universities and, well, all people who were relying on state funding to toe the ground, you know, so it would have made a big difference. It could have made a big difference in the activity of students and in the type of teaching that you got. I know that the faculty got really, really scared. I've read some things of the YWCA kind of went underground as well as in the 50s, and they formed, their conferences were no longer called interracial conferences, they were called human relations conferences. And Ella Baker, Casey Hayden, Mary King were all on the payroll of the YWCA as they were helping SNCC get organized. And they were doing these interracial conferences still and calling them human relations conferences. And they would offer to go to a college. The YWCAs were, and many of these colleges were no longer being supported by the college, but they would call people in the sociology department or political science department and suggest that they come and that they would do a lecture on human relations. And they were able to get into the colleges under under human relations rather than the YWCA. So, I mean, there was a whole lot of underground work that was going on, but it was hard to do, and much harder to do in the 50s and 60s. Mm-hmm. And the black colleges were more open, of course, and the private colleges were more open, but the state colleges pretty much, suspended students. They were careful not to let things be written, editorials for integration. There was one woman at Auburn who's a novelist now. I read in the paper the other day that she got suspended because she wrote an editorial for integration at Auburn University, and she it's Seton. Her name is Seton. She has a new book out, and they were doing book signings lately. She wrote the book on Peachtree Street and all of those. So
Ann Rivers.
Ann Rivers Seton. She got suspended from Auburn for writing in the college newspaper about a pro-integration. So it was, the colleges clamped down.
Atlanta's business establishment supported Ellis Arnold in his race against Eugene Talmadge in 1942. and Mr. Carmichael again in 1946. But they never surfaced again until Carl Sanders ran in 1962. Some people give Sanders the credit for being a new South governor because of his moderation on racial issues and his progressive program for Georgia. What was the civil rights movement at that time?
Well, by then I was, what was his date?
He was elected in 1962.
1962, I was then living in the coal fields of Virginia. And it was kind of like I disappeared from the civil rights movement. I'd been active in those early days at GSCW. By the time I got to the University of Virginia in '48, the first black student came into the law school there, and he and I were on panels together and talked about stuff. But then I ended up teaching way out in the coal fields, and the issues there were strip mining, black lung disease, union reform. And so my students and I got very much involved, and I got very much involved in the United Mine Workers and all of the problems there. So the civil rights movement just kind of passed me by. I would read about it in the paper. I'd read about Selma and say, oh my gosh, if I had stayed in Georgia, I would be there, you know. I would be involved. I would have been involved probably in the sit-ins in Atlanta and stuff like that. But I was not, I was not there. I was involved and got in trouble, actually, as a teacher and with my students in some of the protests against strip mining and working with community groups and activist groups in the mountains. So I left the civil rights. And so when I came back to Georgia, I was out of Georgia for 50 years. So I moved back to Georgia 10 years ago, and it's kind of like the politics are something I don't even understand anymore. I mean, it is another world. I mean, we had no Republicans when I was here. Now, I mean, we had the conservatives and the liberal Democrats, and so it's probably better that they call themselves what they are now instead of pretending to be Democrats when they weren't. So it's like, I've had a hard time relearning Georgia politics, and it's sort of sad because that was going to be my life at one time. But then marriage and becoming a college professor, teaching sociology and anthropology, and being in the coal fields for 40 years really got me involved in Virginia politics, but only on sort of that, and Appalachian Studies. I started one of the first courses in Appalachian Studies and been very much involved in Appalachian regional kinds of issues, and particular around mining. And so I was no longer involved in the sort of real Southern civil rights movement, but I followed it in the newspaper, but that's all. So the Georgia politics, I disappeared from my life.
You hear a lot of criticism of federal programs nowadays. What effect do you think the Appalachian Commission has had on Appalachia?
It's modernized a lot of stuff, but it opened it up with big roads. I was always critical of it. As a matter of fact, when Jimmy Carter came in as president, I was on his list to be the director of the Appalachian Regional Commission. There was no way I would have been selected because I had been fairly critical of the Appalachian Regional Commission for putting their money into such, not really doing anything. For instance, land reform is one of the biggest problems in the mountains. When you have 80% of the land and minerals owned by coal companies, there's no way that those counties can really, make big changes. They don't have the resources. So you can put in big roads that helps people get out, but the mechanization of the mines, the consolidation of the mines, the lack of safety in the mines, well, such big problems. And what happened was the coal companies kind of co-opted the politics in those states and in those counties, and it was just so they did not. We had to force. I was with a group that forced the Appalachian Regional Commission to do a land study on land and minerals. They had never even done a study which said how much land and how much minerals we even owned, or do anything about the tax structure. There was no severance tax on coal when I got up there. And I started with some of my students and people in town, and some of the little local coal miners, operators, joined in trying to get a severance tax on coal. The small operators were told by the big companies where they had to sell their coal, get out of that. And it took several years, but eventually there was a severance tax on coal, and now all those states have it. So, but there was, it was, they'd done some good stuff. They built some schools, they did some water systems, and I used to go with groups, and they've done some good stuff with education, but they have not gotten to some of the root causes. Maybe they never would or could, but so I've been sort of a I wouldn't vote to do away with it, but I also would like them to be more involved in sustainable grassroots community development.
What did you think of Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty?
It was helpful. It was really helpful. It was good. I guess they lost the war, but there's still a lot of poverty because nobody's dealing with the root causes. And so you have continuing problems of poverty, outmigration. I don't see, maybe, right now the mountain top removal type of mining and the real push now for more coal and using more coal in our energy crisis is absolutely devastating what's left of the mountains. And what's so sad is it's affecting the water resources for the whole eastern seaboard, because they're covering up rivers and covering up streams with all that overburden, and water tables are dropping. This is not the way, this is not sustainable. It's not at all sustainable. So,
what do you think are the root causes of poverty? Is it education, as most people think?
It's the great division between the rich and the poor, which is the greatest we've ever had. And the tax system, which favors corporate businesses. We need land reform in many places too. And we need, I guess that's why I'm an Obama supporter. I don't think even there he will be able to do all that needs to be done. But this sort of, the way in which corporate capitalism has taken over without any sort of criticism of it, the market is going to solve it all. It is not. We've got to have more regulation. We've got to have a greater distribution of the wealth. And we've got to put some resources in the hands of rural communities. And rural policies and agribusiness policies have got to be changed. We've got to go back to more regional agriculture. And there's just a whole lot of structural changes, I think, that need to be made. The economy is not a moral economy. And so that's it, I think, is that distribution of wealth. We need some jubilees.
If you're asked to give advice to a young student at, it's Georgia College and State University now, who is interested in becoming involved in politics, what would you say to them?
I'd say do it. I mean, they need to participate. They need to not just vote, but they need to really get involved. And as 18-year-olds, they can, you know. When I did the inaugural lecture for the new president down there, and what I did was talk about the 40s and the kind of civic education we got, the kind of participation in trying to develop integration, and I just said they need to go back to having more civic education, more political education, and more participation in politics by young people. I don't think the League of Women Voters still exists down there. Of course, it's now a co-ed school, and the YWCA hardly exists. And there's no other organization pushing. The denominations don't push it. The social gospel is kind of dead. And so I would like to, I think it's happening. And some of it is happening through service learning. Students have been asking for more responsibility to the communities where they live and to the communities they come from. And they go and work with, you know, poor or with communities, and sort of that has sort of brought forth a group of students now that are pushing to be more activists. So I see movement in some of the colleges. And so it's time the administration got on board and made this more possible. And because those were the experiences that educated me more than a lot of the classes. It was those extra, I went, in 1945, I took a bus from Atlanta, Georgia to Hartford, Connecticut, 3-day journey. And worked, I was with a YWCA project called Student in Industry. We all had to go out, we lived in a co-op house, it was interracial. There was a young Japanese there who had come out of the concentration camps. There was a black student from Harvard whose parents were afraid for him to even come to that summer project because there were 2 young girls from Georgia going to be their white girls, and they were afraid that they would mistreat their son. But we became really good friends. We all had to get jobs, and at night we had seminars on labor and industry. I mean, that was an incredible education. I worked in a place that made the Norton bomb site, and they put me on as an expediter to run around the factory to put things together to make things produced. But they did it mostly as a joke because I spoke with such a Southern accent that they thought it would amuse the workers. So that was my job for the summer until they discovered that I had worked in the library. And they put me then in a room with all the patents to develop a library system for all of their papers and things. So they finally put me to work at a decent job. But that summer was an incredible education. And so I think through service learning at colleges today that students are beginning to participate more. And so my advice is to get involved in politics. It's pretty important.
Well, you certainly have, and you've had a wonderful career. And I want to thank you on behalf of the Richard Russell Library and the University of Georgia for being with us.
I'm pleased to have been asked. Thank you for letting me tell some of my story.
Anything else you want to say?
I don't think so. You may want to read this thing that I wrote about the. Well, you have a copy here. That's mine. He'll give you a copy, but you need a copy of that because it really gives you a lot of names of everybody in the
You know, one
who
of
were
my
involved in this project in the Carmichael campaign headquarters. I think this
one
will
of
be
my great
helpful.
heroes in this life has been a fellow named Walter Brooks. I guess you won't remember Walter Brooks. He was associated with Senator Talmadge, Governor Talmadge,
Okay.
Senator Talmadge, and he was my mentor as a speechwriter. And he had the most respect for DeWitt Roberts you'd never believe. DeWitt Roberts was his hero.
Well, DeWitt was a great friend of mine. He was so upset that I went on to Duke. He wanted me to stay and be part of that. They had my whole life planned. DeWitt had my life planned. Alan Colley, whose mother was the head of the women's campaign, and they were big politicians and came out of mill-owning families in Grantville. He was at that meeting when we all got arrested, and he and I were kind of boyfriends that summer. I mean, they had the idea that he was going to be governor and I was going to marry Alan, and that we were going to be the first family of Georgia. That was the scheme. Well, I said that, that he had just graduated from Princeton and he was kind of a Kennedy sort of person. He got killed that next summer. He was a pilot and he was with the National Guard, and there was a crash and he died. And so that ruined that little episode. Besides that, I had gone to Duke and had met someone, and so that romance was gone. Wasn't much of a romance. It was just kind of a little flirtation. And but DeWitt had it all planned, and then he had it planned that I would buy this county newspaper. And a friend of mine, Amelia Nodler, was running a newspaper in the county. She was for a GSCW student. And so then I would run for the legislature. So they had it all, my life planned, and I was excited about it until I changed my plans and became a college professor instead. But I've always was, as a teacher, I must say that I was more of an organizer of students than I was the proper lecturer. I got them involved in grassroots groups, involved in United Mine Workers and black, but this was their family's problems. I mean, the students started Virginia Citizens for Better Reclamation. As a result, I got fired. And it was for nurturing radical students, being said. So I must say that I was politically involved with my students in all these social movements in the mountains. And that to me was, I told the dean, well, I thought that was what teaching was all about, was nurturing radical students. But anyway, so I continued to be active politically wherever I was, but which made it difficult, somewhat difficult, in terms of,
Did you
the
know
administration.
George Wilder?
I didn't know him personally, but very excited, yeah.
He was
I
a
know
great
who he
friend of
was.
mine.
Oh, great, great, yeah.
When he ran for governor, well, he was lieutenant governor.
Yeah.
When he ran for governor, I helped host a series of fundraisers for him
Oh, did you? Good for you.
in the city of Atlanta.
All right, good.
He was,
yeah.
He was elected and then reelected.
Mm-hmm.
Very nice guy.
Can I ask a question while the camera's still rolling? Because I didn't turn it off.
Oh, you didn't turn
Yeah.
it off. Uh-oh. Yeah.
I wanted to ask one more question, and Bob, you can chime in on this too, but what impact do you think World War II had and the end of the war have on the election in '46 for governor, or was there an impact? Because Ellis Arnold was obviously elected as the war was beginning for the United States, and taking this more progressive path, and then with the close of the war, did that have an impact on what happened in '46?
I don't know. I think it was more the sort of the beginning civil rights and the sort of beginning to integrate facilities and things that really produced more fear on part of people that influenced it more, because actually there was sort of a euphoria at the end of the war. I mean, you know, about peace and prosperity, and that should have helped more than hinder.
And he did win the popular vote.
Yeah,
so-
yeah.
Well,
So-
the problem then was the county unit system.
Yeah.
When you take 3 small counties with a population of 30,000, can equal the vote of Fulton County, which has a population of 400,000. There's no way in the world winning the popular vote is going to get you elected. You got to run those in those counties. You got to have county organizations. You got to have the sheriffs and the county commissioners and all those people out there turning out the vote for you. And that's why the machine in Georgia was so powerful. It started with Eugene Talmadge in 1926 when he ran for agriculture commissioner, and extended through 1962 when the county unit system was abolished, and the county unit system elected all the governors between that period, and therefore you didn't get candidates running because they feared losing, because they couldn't win out in the hustings.
He was an incredible speaker too. I mean, I went to one of his big rallies, and the first thing he'd do is get up on the stage, and it was an outdoor stage, and he had people up in the trees that were going to yell to him, and he would, you know, they'd say, "Take off your coat, Gene." Red suspenders.
Yeah.
"Tell us about your son Hummon. Hummon's fitting the war." And then he did this whole thing about the farmer has, you know, 3 friends, Sears Roebuck, God Almighty, and Gene Talmadge, you know. And he was incredible. I mean, it was just a show. It was a wonderful show. And he was just that real populist leader among, he had bragged that he never carried a county with a streetcar in it. You know, all
Didn't
those,
want to carry a county.
Yeah, didn't want to carry. And he could jump on the media and all this media against him, and that just proved to be fine. Well, when I got to the coal fields, it was kind of like the coal companies had the same kind of control over local politicians in the coal fields that Talmadge and his gang had over the Pine Tree counties, you know?
You know, if they gave Oscars to politicians for acting, Eugene Talmadge would have a mantle full.
Oh, wouldn't he?
Because
though?
he was a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of the University of Georgia. Brilliant man.
Smart as a whip.
He was a 135-pound lineman on the Georgia football team. He was an accomplished boxer. But you would think that he was just an old dirt farmer from Telfair County. And he had people convinced of that, and they never saw through his acting ability.
Well, my family were always anti-Talmadge. My father was a rural mail carrier. He almost got fired once, I think maybe it was when Ellis Arnold got elected. He put aspirins in the mailbox of this man he'd argued politics with, a big Talmadge supporter. Well, he got reported, and he almost got fired from carrying the mail because he had done this, put this aspirin in this mailbox. And so I grew up pretty strong anti-Talmadge, but I must say I admired the old man for his acting ability and he was incredibly entertaining as well. So,
What do you think caused all of his demagoguery?
How you get elected. That's how you get elected.
Did he lose to Arnold in 42 because of the UGA scandal? And
I think it was. I think regardless of, you know, poor farmers and wanting the small, you know, cheap tags and all that sort of stuff, and the feeling that he was on their side, they still believed in education, and they wanted their kids to get a good education. So I think that whole thing, that allowed Ellis Arnold to get elected. And so if that was the main thing, was to get those colleges reaccredited so that people's kids would have a decent education. And
Arnold had a lot of pluses.
in,
Arnold had been, Attorney General. He was very well liked. He had the legislature behind him, and that's important.
I was sorry that he never got a real good federal position or continued in politics or was able to continue in politics. I mean, he just kind of was not, he was thought, I know he was recommended for several positions in the federal government. I mean, because he was a good politician and a good statesman. So, but I did do some work on his book.
The Shore Dimly Seen.
Yeah.
What did you do for that?
I just did some research. DeWitt Roberts wrote the book, mostly.
Ghostwriters aren't supposed to say things like
I know
that.
it. I'm not supposed to say that. He helped with the book. He did the major research. He did some of the research. We did some of the research, I say.
I used to face that all the time. People said, "Who wrote his speech?" He did.
Yeah.
Always, he did. And I've written speeches for governors that never saw them until they walked out the door with them.
Well, I think that the few little speeches I got to write for Thompson, his little fireside chat things he did. Do you remember those?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I always felt sorry for Melvin Thompson because when he served those 2 years, he really never had a chance.
Mm-hmm.
The legislature was opposed to him because it had elected Talmadge, and they were angry because the courts had overturned them. So they didn't give him any money. They did nothing for him.
Yeah.
And he sat there for 2 years, signing executive orders and making civic club speeches. But he really never had a chance.
No. And so that was my big moment in politics in Georgia. It was not much of a big moment. So I left and went to Virginia. Well, we all were kind of scattering at the end of that campaign. I tell you, we were all talking about leaving the country. Bill Allen, who had been one of the PR people there, and everybody was talking about leaving. Ed Bridges, I think, was one of the reporters' names that worked with us. And there was some possibility of my going to work with the Atlanta Constitution, and I was kind of thinking about that. And I'd talked to them about it, but then that whole marriage, going back to graduate school, and becoming a college professor. So, but because I was a little bit more of an activist as a college professor, that career was fraught with danger too. Okay. Well, thank you for
Thank you.
letting me.
That was really good.
Thank you.